They say that sometimes the most innocent discoveries can reveal the darkest secrets, but I never expected that helping my wife with her charity work would expose her systematic betrayal and lead me to orchestrate a revenge so comprehensive that it destroyed not just her affair, but her entire carefully constructed double life. My name is Alexander, and this is the story of how uncovering my wife's deception through her volunteer activities led me to expose her infidelity in the most devastating way possible. My wife Victoria and I had been married for 7 years when she became deeply involved in charity work for a local organization that helped underprivileged families. Victoria had always been compassionate and community-minded, so her decision to volunteer extensively seemed like a natural extension of her caring personality. The charity work required Victoria to spend significant amounts of time away from home, often in the evenings and on weekends. She would attend fundraising events, coordinate donation drives, and work directly with families who needed assistance. I was proud of her dedication to helping others and supportive of the time and energy she was investing in making a difference in our community. Victoria's involvement with the charity seemed to energize her in ways I hadn't seen in years. She was more enthusiastic about life, more engaged in conversations, and seemed to have found a sense of purpose that brought her genuine happiness. She would come home from her volunteer work with stories about the families she was helping and the impact the organization was making. As Victoria became more involved with the charity, she began to mention a particular colleague named David who worked as the organization's program coordinator. David was apparently very dedicated to the cause and had been instrumental in expanding the charity's reach and effectiveness. Victoria spoke about David with obvious admiration for his commitment and leadership. I was initially pleased that Victoria had found such meaningful work and had connected with people who shared her passion for helping others. The charity work seemed to be fulfilling for her in ways that her previous activities had not been, and I appreciated that she was making a positive impact in our community. However, after several months of Victoria's intensive involvement with the charity, I began to notice some changes in her behavior and schedule that seemed unusual. She was spending increasingly long hours at charity events and meetings, often not returning home until very late in the evening. Her explanations for these extended absences were always related to urgent charity business or emergency situations that required immediate attention. Victoria also began to be less communicative about the specific details of her charity work. While she had initially shared stories and updates about the families she was helping, she became more vague about her activities and seemed reluctant to discuss the specifics of what she was doing during her volunteer time. Most concerning of all, Victoria began to receive frequent phone calls and text messages that she would take privately, often stepping into another room or going outside to have these conversations. When I asked about these calls, she would explain that they were related to charity business and that she needed to maintain confidentiality about the families they were helping. These explanations seemed reasonable at first, and I trusted Victoria's commitment to protecting the privacy of the people the charity was serving. I assumed that her increased privacy and longer hours were simply the result of taking on more responsibility within the organization. But as more time passed, I began to feel that Victoria's charity work was consuming an unusually large portion of her time and attention. She was rarely home during evenings and weekends, and when she was home, she seemed distracted and preoccupied with charity-related matters. I also noticed that Victoria had become more secretive about her phone and computer usage. She would close her laptop when I entered the room, and she had started keeping her phone with her at all times, even taking it into the bathroom. These behaviors seemed inconsistent with someone who was simply doing volunteer work. When I mentioned my concerns about the amount of time Victoria was spending on charity work, she became defensive and suggested that I didn't understand the importance of the work she was doing. She accused me of being unsupportive of her efforts to help people in need and implied that I was being selfish by wanting more of her time and attention. This response troubled me because it was unlike Victoria to be so dismissive of my concerns or to suggest that I was unsupportive of charitable activities. Throughout our marriage, I had always encouraged her volunteer work and community involvement, and I had never complained about the time she spent helping others. I decided to take a more active interest in Victoria's charity work to better understand what was requiring so much of her time and energy. I offered to help with fundraising events, donation drives, and other activities that might benefit from additional volunteer support. Victoria's reaction to my offer was surprisingly negative. She claimed that the charity had strict policies about new volunteers and that there was a lengthy screening and training process that would be required before I could participate. She suggested that it would be easier and more efficient for her to continue handling her responsibilities independently. This response seemed unusual because most charitable organizations are eager to recruit new volunteers and would welcome additional help with their activities. Victoria's reluctance to involve me in her charity work raised questions about what she was actually doing during the time she claimed to be volunteering. I decided to conduct some research into the charity organization to learn more about their activities and to understand what kind of work Victoria was doing. What I discovered was shocking and revealed the extent of Victoria's deception. The charity organization did exist and was legitimate, but when I contacted them to inquire about volunteer opportunities, I learned that Victoria was not listed as an active volunteer. The staff members I spoke with had no record of anyone named Victoria working with their organization, and they had never heard of the specific programs and activities that Victoria had been describing to me. This discovery was devastating because it meant that Victoria had been lying to me about her charity work for months. She had been using the charity as a cover story for activities that she was hiding from me, and she had been systematically deceiving me about how she was spending her time. I realized that Victoria's supposed charity work was actually an elaborate cover for an affair. The long hours, the secretive phone calls, the defensive behavior, and the reluctance to involve me in her activities all made sense when viewed as attempts to hide an extramarital relationship. The most painful aspect of this discovery was understanding that Victoria had been exploiting my respect for charitable work and my trust in her compassion to cover up her betrayal. She had been using my admiration for her volunteer activities to justify her absences and to deflect my questions about her behavior. I also realized that David, the program coordinator Victoria had mentioned so frequently, was likely her affair partner. Her obvious admiration for his dedication and leadership had actually been descriptions of her romantic feelings for him, disguised as professional respect. I decided to gather more evidence of Victoria's affair before confronting her about her deception. I wanted to understand the full scope of her betrayal and to document her lies in a way that would make it impossible for her to deny or minimize what she had been doing. The investigation I conducted revealed the extent of Victoria's systematic deception. She had been meeting David regularly at hotels, restaurants, and other locations while claiming to be doing charity work. She had been using fake charity events and meetings as excuses to spend time with him, and she had been lying to me about virtually every aspect of her supposed volunteer activities. I also discovered that Victoria and David had been planning to leave their respective spouses and start a new life together. They had been discussing divorce strategies, financial arrangements, and living situations while maintaining their affairs and deceiving their families. Most shocking of all, I learned that Victoria had been using our joint credit cards and bank accounts to fund her affair. She had been paying for hotel rooms, expensive dinners, and gifts for David while telling me that the expenses were related to charity fundraising and events. Victoria had been systematically stealing from our marriage to finance her betrayal, and she had been using charitable work as a cover story to justify the missing money. She had been exploiting both my trust and our shared financial resources to support her affair. I realized that Victoria's deception went far beyond a simple affair. She had been running an elaborate con game that involved lying about her activities, stealing money from our accounts, and using charitable work as a cover for her systematic betrayal of our marriage. I decided that Victoria needed to face consequences that would expose not just her affair, but the elaborate web of lies and theft she had constructed to hide it. I wanted her to understand that her deception had been discovered and documented, and that she would face appropriate consequences for her systematic betrayal. The plan I developed was designed to expose Victoria's affair and her lies in the most devastating and public way possible. I wanted her to lose not just our marriage, but also her reputation and her ability to continue deceiving people about her character and integrity. Phase 1 involved documenting every aspect of Victoria's deception, including her lies about charity work, her theft of money from our accounts, and her systematic betrayal of our marriage. I wanted to create a comprehensive record of her dishonesty and manipulation. Phase 2 involved gathering evidence of Victoria's affair with David, including photographs, communications, and witness statements that would prove the extent of their relationship and their plans to leave their spouses. Phase 3 involved exposing Victoria's lies to the people who had been deceived by her fake charity work, including friends, family members, and community members who had supported what they believed were legitimate charitable activities. Phase 4 was more personal and involved confronting Victoria with evidence of her affair and her systematic deception in a way that would force her to acknowledge the full scope of her betrayal. The final phase involved the legal and practical steps necessary to end our marriage, recover the money Victoria had stolen, and ensure that she faced appropriate consequences for her theft and deception. The investigation phase took several weeks, during which I worked with a private investigator to document Victoria's activities and gather evidence of her affair. We were able to photograph Victoria and David together at hotels and restaurants, and we obtained records showing the pattern of their meetings over several months. We also gathered financial evidence showing how Victoria had been using our joint accounts to pay for her affair-related expenses. The credit card and bank records showed a clear pattern of charges for hotels, restaurants, and gifts that corresponded to her supposed charity activities. Most importantly, we documented Victoria's lies about her charity work by obtaining statements from the actual charity organization confirming that she had never been a volunteer. We also gathered evidence showing how she had used fake charity events and meetings as cover stories for her affair. The confrontation happened on a Saturday evening in November, exactly 8 months after I had first become suspicious about Victoria's charity work. I had arranged for Victoria to come home expecting a normal evening together, but I had prepared a comprehensive presentation of all the evidence I had gathered about her affair and her systematic deception. Instead of the quiet evening she expected, I presented Victoria with detailed documentation of her affair with David, records of her lies about charity work, and evidence of her theft from our joint accounts. I also had photographs and witness statements that proved the extent of her betrayal. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. I had financial records showing her theft, photographs proving her affair, and documentation showing her systematic lies about charitable activities. I also had evidence of her plans with David to leave their spouses and start a new life together. Victoria's reaction was initially one of shock and panic as she realized that her elaborate deception had been discovered and documented in detail. She tried to deny the evidence at first, claiming that I had misunderstood her relationship with David and that her charity work was legitimate. But the evidence was too comprehensive and specific for her denials to be credible. I had documentation showing not just her affair, but also her systematic lies, her theft of money, and her plans to abandon our marriage. When Victoria realized that denial wasn't working, she changed tactics and tried to justify her affair by claiming that our marriage had been unhappy and that she had found genuine love with David. She suggested that her deception had been necessary to protect my feelings while she figured out what she wanted to do. But I was not interested in Victoria's attempts to rationalize her systematic betrayal and theft. She had deliberately and maliciously deceived me for months, stolen money from our accounts, and used charitable work as a cover for her affair. She needed to face the consequences of her actions. That evening, I also revealed that I had consulted with attorneys about my legal options for addressing Victoria's theft and adultery. I told her that I planned to pursue both divorce proceedings and civil remedies to recover the money she had stolen and to hold her accountable for her systematic deception. I explained that Victoria's use of our joint accounts to fund her affair constituted theft, and that her systematic lies about charity work constituted fraud. I wanted her to understand that she would face serious legal and financial consequences for her actions. Victoria was devastated to learn that her affair and theft could result in legal action, and that she might face significant financial penalties for the damage she had caused. She begged me to handle the matter privately and suggested that we could resolve our problems through counseling rather than legal proceedings. But I had already made the decision that our marriage was over and that Victoria needed to face appropriate consequences for her systematic betrayal and theft. Her deception had been too extensive and malicious for me to consider reconciliation or private resolution. The legal and financial consequences for Victoria were swift and comprehensive. I filed for divorce immediately, citing her adultery and theft as grounds for the dissolution of our marriage. The evidence I had gathered provided clear documentation of her betrayal, making it impossible for her to contest the divorce or claim an equal share of our assets. I also filed civil lawsuits against Victoria for theft and fraud, seeking to recover all of the money she had stolen plus damages for the harm her actions had caused. The financial records showing her use of our joint accounts to fund her affair made these lawsuits straightforward and likely to succeed. Most importantly, I exposed Victoria's lies about charity work to our friends, family members, and community. I shared the evidence showing that she had never actually been involved in charitable activities and that she had been using fake charity work as a cover for her affair. The exposure of Victoria's deception was devastating to her reputation and her relationships. People who had admired her supposed charitable work felt betrayed and manipulated when they learned that her activities had been fabricated. Friends and family members who had supported her volunteer efforts were shocked to discover that they had been deceived. Victoria's affair partner David also faced consequences when his wife learned about their relationship and their plans to leave their spouses. David's marriage ended in divorce, and his reputation in the community was severely damaged by the exposure of his affair. The most satisfying aspect of Victoria's downfall was watching her realize that her elaborate deception had ultimately achieved the opposite of what she had intended. Instead of allowing her to maintain her affair while keeping our marriage intact, her lies had led to the complete destruction of both relationships and her reputation. Victoria had thought she was being clever by using charity work as a cover for her affair, exploiting my respect for volunteer activities to justify her absences and deflect my questions. But she had failed to consider that her deception would eventually be discovered and that she would face serious consequences for her systematic betrayal. The divorce proceedings were decisive and comprehensive. Victoria's adultery and theft were well documented through the evidence I had gathered, and she had no grounds to contest the dissolution of our marriage or to claim a significant portion of our remaining assets. Victoria was forced to return all of the money she had stolen from our joint accounts, and she was also required to pay additional damages for the harm her theft had caused. The court recognized that her systematic deception had been particularly egregious because it had involved exploiting charitable work and community trust. Most importantly, I was able to rebuild my life and my financial security free from Victoria's deception and betrayal. The recovered money allowed me to restore our savings and to move forward with financial goals that her theft had delayed or prevented. The experience taught me valuable lessons about the importance of verifying claims about volunteer activities and being skeptical of explanations that seem designed to deflect questions or avoid scrutiny. I learned that people can exploit charitable work and community involvement to cover up systematic deception. Looking back on this experience, I am proud of the way I handled the discovery of Victoria's affair and her systematic lies. I could have confronted her immediately when I first became suspicious, but instead I took the time to gather comprehensive evidence that exposed the full scope of her deception. The marriage that I had thought was built on shared values and mutual trust had actually been undermined by systematic lies and theft. But the process of exposing Victoria's betrayal had also revealed my own strength and resilience, and it had prepared me to build healthier relationships in the future. Victoria's affair and her elaborate deception had been interconnected crimes that had both damaged our marriage and violated the trust that was essential to our relationship. She had been willing to exploit charitable work and community involvement to cover up her betrayal, and she had used systematic lies to maintain her double life. The revenge I orchestrated against Victoria was comprehensive and devastating, but it was also necessary to protect my interests and ensure that justice was served. She had chosen to build her affair on stolen money and fabricated charitable activities, and she had to face the full consequences of her choices. The financial records that had enabled Victoria's theft had also provided the evidence that exposed her affair and her systematic deception. The irony was not lost on me that the very accounts she had used to fund her betrayal had also documented her crimes and provided the proof needed to hold her accountable. In the end, Victoria's elaborate deception had achieved the opposite of what she had intended. Instead of allowing her to maintain her affair while preserving our marriage, her lies had ultimately cost her both relationships and had resulted in serious legal and financial penalties. The most important outcome of this entire experience was that I was able to reclaim my life and my financial security from Victoria's web of lies and theft. I was no longer living in a marriage built on deception and systematic betrayal, and I was free to build a new life based on honesty and integrity. The evidence that had exposed Victoria's affair served as a reminder that systematic deception ultimately leaves traces that can be discovered and documented. Her careful planning and elaborate cover stories had ultimately been no match for thorough investigation and analysis. Both Victoria and David learned that affairs built on lies and theft come with consequences that extend far beyond the immediate pleasure they are meant to provide. They lost their marriages, their reputations, and their standing in the community. They discovered that the trust and love of their spouses, once broken through systematic betrayal, could not be easily repaired or replaced. Their affair had destroyed not just their marriages, but also their relationships with friends and family members who felt deceived by their lies. The revenge was complete, the truth was exposed, and I was finally free to build a new life based on the values of honesty and integrity that Victoria had abandoned. I had won not just a legal victory in the divorce and civil proceedings, but a moral victory that validated my commitment to truth and accountability in relationships. Looking forward, I carried with me the lessons I had learned about the importance of verifying claims about volunteer activities, the dangers of systematic deception disguised as charitable work, and the need to investigate suspicious patterns rather than accepting explanations at face value. The experience had been painful and financially damaging, but it had also been educational and ultimately liberating. I had learned that I was capable of handling systematic betrayal with strategic thinking and appropriate legal action, and I had proven to myself that I would not tolerate deception and theft even when disguised as charitable activities. Victoria's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of using charitable work to cover up affairs, and about the way that systematic deception ultimately destroys not just the relationships it is meant to preserve, but the character and integrity of the people who choose lies over honesty. Her downfall served as a reminder that exploiting charitable activities and community trust for personal gain is ultimately unsustainable and self-destructive, and that systematic deception ultimately destroys not just the marriages it is meant to preserve, but the reputation and standing of the people who choose betrayal over commitment. The joint accounts that had been meant to represent our shared financial partnership had instead become the funding source for Victoria's affair and the evidence I needed to expose her crimes and reclaim my future. In the end, the revenge was not just about recovering the money Victoria had stolen or exposing her affair. It was about vindicating the principles of honesty, marital commitment, and charitable integrity that she had abandoned, and about proving that systematic deception will ultimately be discovered and punished. The marriage that Victoria had destroyed through her lies and theft was replaced by a new understanding of what genuine relationships should look like, built on transparency, mutual respect, and shared commitment to honesty in all aspects of life. Her betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been educational, and I was determined to use those lessons to build better relationships in the future based on the values that truly mattered to me. Victoria's affair and theft, and the elaborate deception she had constructed to cover her crimes, had ultimately cost her everything that should have mattered to her: her marriage, her reputation, and her standing in the community. The financial records that exposed her theft and the evidence that documented her lies served as permanent reminders that truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully people try to hide their deception behind charitable activities and community involvement. The revenge was complete, justice was served, and I was finally free to move forward with my life, knowing that I had handled one of the most sophisticated forms of marital betrayal with dignity, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment to truth and legal accountability.